All right, hello everyone. Welcome back into part 2 of this video of Matt Sports Talk. So in this video, we are going to be looking at the last two teams that should have been in the national, or the two teams that probably should not have been in the national tournament but ended up getting in. And these two teams were absolutely beyond shocking, at least to me. So we are going to dive into that real quick as we end this video, because in my last video I talked about the other three teams that were also really shocking to me. That was OUAZ, Evangel, and who's the other one? It was Evangel, OUAZ, and Southern Oregon. That was it. Southern Oregon, OUAZ, and Evangel. But so really, other than that, there were really no other major upsets except for these last two teams that I want to talk about. And the first team being, let me scroll down to them. Okay, so we're now going to talk about Walla Walla. And this is a team that is also based out of the Cascade. Now, I talked about Southern Oregon in my last video not being in, despite them being ranked 24th in the nation. They did have the second lowest ranking in the ARC. They were actually they were ranked, I believe, 40th or 41st in the RPI, so not too terribly bad there. They were ranked high up in the Massey as well, which was a little bit of a shock. Now, this particular team was a huge shock. Walla Walla ranked 59th in the RPI. Their strength of schedule, though, was really good at 27th. And then looking, let me get back to my ARC ranking here and talk about Walla Walla. And they were so they were ranked 8th in the ARC ranking, so that's really, really good. So they actually were 5 spots ahead of Southern Oregon in that category. So in a way, I do understand why Walla Walla got in ahead of Southern Oregon. Now you look at Walla Walla, and they were 10-10 in their conference. They were 14 and 15 overall, 14 and 16 overall. So in terms of those records, that was beyond a shock that you have a team that's 10-10 in conference that gets in. And that just doesn't seem right to me. But they did have a really high ARC ranking of 8th, so 5 spots ahead of Southern Oregon. Now, they were ahead of Southern Oregon in the RPI, because in the RPI, Walla Walla was 59th. Southern Oregon, I believe, was 71st or 73rd. And Southern Oregon did have a worse strength of schedule number than Walla Walla did. Walla Walla had a strength of schedule rating of 27, which is still really, really, really good. And then looking at them in the Massey rating, Walla Walla I believe they were higher up than, they were 24th in the final Massey rating. They actually gained 10 spots. They were 14 and 12 overall. They were 10 and 10 in conference, but obviously the Cascade is just such a tough conference. Now, Walla Walla's strength of schedule they actually were ranked first in their strength of schedule in the final Massey rating poll. Now, again, I think, Walla Walla, they were receiving votes. They actually were, believe it or not, they were the very last team receiving votes. Now, here's where it really gets interesting, is comparing them with Spring Arbor out of the Crossroads League, which Spring Arbor was a team that I didn't think would be in any way, despite them being 23-9, because they didn't play anybody in conference. They did have 2 ranked wins against Marion, which obviously looked really good to them. But outside of that, really, and Spring Arbor did have the upset win against Taylor in the opening round of a league tournament, which Taylor actually ended up getting in, being 20-11. But I thought Taylor had a much stronger resume than Spring Arbor did, and that obviously ended up being the case. And I thought Taylor had a much stronger resume than Huntington, because I figured Huntington would definitely be on the bubble, especially with them having the upset win at home over Taylor, and that was probably the difference maker for Huntington being in, honestly. And then looking at Walla Walla, so they did have a high Massey rating, 24th. Their ARC ranking was 8th. They were 59th in the RPI. Their strength of schedule, though, was absolutely really, really good. So at least in those numbers, you can obviously understand why. And then comparing them with Spring Arbor, Walla Walla 24th in the RPI compared to 38th for Spring Arbor. Spring Arbor's strength of schedule was 42nd compared to 1st for Walla Walla. Now, Walla Walla, they actually took number 1 in the country, Eastern Oregon, to the brim in that conference tournament, in that conference opening round game, I should say. Eastern Oregon was able to hang on in 5 sets, 15-12. So that's, I'm sure, another reason why Walla Walla got in. But they were quite a big shock to me. Spring Arbor was 23-10, and then comparing Spring Arbor with the ARC numbers, whenever my internet loads again, Walla Walla was ranked 8th in the ARC. Spring Arbor was ranked 10th. So, yeah, I mean, you could argue that they were pretty even in terms of the ARC, and that is true. But you look at the RPI comparing those two teams. Let me get back down here on my iPad to where I know Walla Walla was 40. Okay, they were 59th in the RPI. And Spring Arbor was actually way ahead of them. Spring Arbor was 40th in the RPI. Their strength of schedule was 58th. Walla Walla was 59th in the RPI. Their strength of schedule was 27. So that obviously is a huge difference. You have 27th compared to 58th for Spring Arbor. So maybe that's another reason why Walla Walla got in ahead of Spring Arbor. That obviously would make sense to me. So that is an updated view on Walla Walla. And then the last team that I wanted to talk about was Northwest out of Washington. Now this was this was probably the biggest shock to me. Now for Northwest out of Washington, now for them, they also play in the Cascade. Now they were at just outside the top 25. Literally the first team just outside the top 25 in terms of the rankings. So obviously, that makes a lot of sense to me on why they got in. But you could argue that for Northwest, they were 69th in the RPI. So that doesn't really make sense to me in that regard of why they got in. Their strength of schedule though was really good at 41st. So they had a strength of schedule of 41st. Walla Walla's strength of schedule was 27. So both those teams actually had a much better strength of schedule than Spring Arbor. And Spring Arbor's strength of schedule was 58th. So, Northwest was at 41 and Walla Walla was 27th compared to 58th for Spring Arbor. So you can obviously understand why Walla Walla got in ahead of Spring Arbor, even though Walla Walla was literally the last team in receiving votes, right behind Spring Arbor, I might add. So, obviously, I guess it doesn't really matter in terms of the receiving votes teams or those ranked inside the top 25. I guess it just really depends on the Massey, RPI, and ARC, which in terms of those, at least in terms of the RPI and the ARC, that definitely favored Walla Walla and Northwest out of Washington over Spring Arbor. That is for sure. And honestly, those two teams got in ahead of Spring Arbor by a pretty wide margin, especially because of the much higher strength of schedule numbers. So that makes a lot of sense there. And then looking at the ARC rankings, once I get back down to that on my iPad, since I'm going back and forth between pages. So looking at the West, Northwest out of Washington, they actually were 9th in the ARC, right behind Walla Walla. So that obviously makes a lot of sense to me based on that. And then in terms of the Massey rating, you had, let me find them real quick. I don't want to, okay, so you had, Northwest, they actually were one spot ahead of Walla Walla in the Massey rating, 23rd, Northwest 16 and 12 overall, 9 and 11 in the conference. So that obviously was a big shock to me because it's like, okay, well, you have a team that's 9 and 11 in the in conference. How in the world are they getting in? Well, that's because Northwest out of Washington had a high Massey rating, just like Walla Walla does. They were right next to each other in the Massey rating, right next to each other in the ARC ranking, and pretty much right next to each other in the RPI. Because the RPI, you had Walla Walla that was 59th, and you had Northwest was 71st. So they roughly were nearly right on each other's tail in terms of the RPI. Well, maybe not really much in the RPI. I mean, they were 12 spots ahead of Walla Walla, 12 spots ahead of Northwest in the RPI. But both Northwest and Walla Walla, they were dead even in the Massey rating right next to each other and dead even in the ARC ranking right next to each other there. So obviously I understand why they both got in ahead of Spring Arbor. I think more so after looking at all of these numbers between the Massey, the ARC, and the RPI. Well, and not just that, but I alluded to a few minutes ago, the strength of schedule numbers were much, much better for Walla Walla and Northwest out of Washington compared to Spring Arbor. So those numbers obviously play into factor at least a little bit. That is for sure. So that is a look at all of the teams that some people would argue should not have made the national tournament. Other people would argue that they should have. So that's a recap video of all of that, or at least my reaction to the official announcement last night of which teams got in, which teams did not. So now I understand. I didn't really understand it much earlier today, But after looking at all these numbers, I definitely understand it a lot better now, and hopefully you do too. You know, if you're watching this video, and you might be like me, or you may have thought like me earlier this morning, you might have thought, man, how in the world did some of these teams like Walla Walla and Northwest get in ahead of Spring Arbor or ahead of Evangel out of Missouri? And then you look at, real quick, you look at that, Northwest and Walla Walla, they were ahead of OUAZ in the Massey rating by seven numbers, and ahead of Evangel by 12 numbers in the Massey rating. So, I think now you probably can understand why both Evangel and OUAZ were left out. But in terms of overall records, it might still be a little bit wild of how come those two teams got left out, and teams like Walla Walla and Northwest getting in. And then lastly, Montana State Northern, they were actually receiving votes in the last poll, 18 and 12. They were 27th in the RPI, or in the ARC, no, I stand corrected, 27th in the Massey. They were another team left out, so 27th in the Massey for them. I've done so much sports today that my mind is a little bit off, so I apologize that it's not super sharp. Okay, Montana State North. Okay, yeah, they were ranked 27th in the Massey. I want to say, 27th in the Massey for Montana State Northern. In the ARC, they were ranked 11th, so the third lowest in the ARC. They were right behind Walla Walla and Northwest. So I guess I can understand why Montana State Northern did not get in based on their low numbers in the ARC. And then looking at their RPI number, I know Northwest and Walla Walla was 59th and 71st respectively. And looking at, let me make sure I got them. And then looking at what team, Montana Tech, no, that's not it. Montana State Northern is what I'm looking for. Yeah, Montana State Northern, I got Montana State Northern, where are you? You should, okay. Oh, there they are. So they were ranked ahead of Walla Walla and Northwest in the RPI. They were 55th in the RPI. Their strength of schedule was 45th, compared to a strength of schedule of 41st for Northwest and a strength of schedule of 27th for Walla Walla. So, I guess you could argue that maybe Montana State Northern should have been in, considering they were receiving votes. It's definitely interesting, I can tell you that. And then, so that is a look at all of the ratings that I wanted to allude to. And of course, you can look up all of this as well. All you got to do is do an internet search. Of course, you can go online and do an internet search on, Massey ratings, for women's NAIA, women's volleyball, RPI numbers, and ARC numbers as well. And then you can, of course, find all of this on your own as well if you really wanted to take an in-depth look at all of the teams that made the national tournament. And of course, you can open up multiple tabs if you have to on your laptop or your desktop. If you wanted to look up, the final top 25 numbers, and then look at all the teams that did not get in, and then for the teams that didn't get in, look at their RPI numbers, look at their ARC numbers, look at their Massey rating numbers. Of course, you can do all that on your own. Obviously, for the sake of this video, that's way too long to dive into each and every individual team that did not get in, to have to look at their Massey, ARC, and RPI numbers. That's way too much to do for one video to give a reaction to all of that. So you can obviously do that on your own yourself, and I highly encourage you to do so. And then finally, looking at the final top NAIA top 25 numbers in terms of teams that got in, which teams did not. Everybody in the top 25 got in the national tournament, and the only exception to that was Southern Oregon that I alluded to. I believe it was in my last video, 14 and 13 for them, but they play in a tough conference. In fact, the Cascade Conference I believe they got 7, might have been 8 actually. I know it was at least 7 teams that got in, maybe 8. That is for sure. So all the teams that are ranked inside the top 25 that all got in Eastern, and this is going from the number 1 team in the country down to 25th in terms of teams that got in. Eastern Oregon, number 1. Providence, Montana, number 2. Northwestern out of Iowa, number 3. Concordia, Nebraska, number 4. Corbin, number 5. Bellevue, Nebraska, number 6. McPherson, Kansas, number 7. Iwu Indiana Wesleyan, number 8. Oklahoma Wesleyan, number 9. Cumberland's number 10. Cumberland's is the only undefeated team, by the way, left inside the top 25, 33-0. That is their record heading into the big dance. The Masters, 11th, followed by Mount Vernon Nazarene out of Ohio, 12th. St. Thomas, Florida, 13th. IU Kokomo, 14th. Missouri Baptist, 15th. College of Idaho, 16th. Viterbo out of Wisconsin, 17th. Lewis Clark State, 18th out of Idaho. Bushnell out of Oregon, 19th. Midland out of Nebraska, 20th. Aquinas out of Michigan, 21st. Mobile out of Alabama, 22nd. Grandview out of Iowa, 23rd. And Dakota Wesleyan, number 25. And those are all the top 25 teams in the final NAIA top 25 poll that made the national tournament. The only exception to that, Southern Oregon, that was ranked 24th. And then finally, all the receiving votes teams that got in the big tournament and which teams did not. In terms of the receiving votes teams that all made the national tournament: Northwest out of Washington, Huntington out of Indiana, Taylor out of Indiana, Lindsey Wilson out of Kentucky, Mid-America Nazarene out of Kansas. You had Marion out of Indiana. You also had Cornerstone out of Michigan that was receiving votes that made the national tournament. They were actually, believe it or not, the second to last team that was announced last night. Walla Walla out of Washington. And you also had and you had Park out of Missouri. So Park out of Missouri was actually only 3 receiving votes. Park out of Missouri was the very last team in. The receiving votes teams that did not make the national tournament were Evangel out of Missouri that had 28 receiving votes. Cumberland out of Tennessee, 23 receiving votes that did not get in the tournament. I alluded to Ottawa out of Arizona, OUAZ. They had 21 receiving votes. They didn't get in. And then you had Montana State University Northern that they were also receiving votes. It looked like they had 16 or 13 receiving votes. It's hard to tell exactly the amount of numbers of receiving votes. And then you had Dakota State out of South Dakota that did not get in, that was receiving votes. Dordt out of Iowa that had 5 receiving votes, I believe 5, either 8 or it looks like 8. But again, I can't. It's hard to tell these numbers. And then Dordt, at least the way it's typed in, it's hard to tell. And then Dordt out of Iowa receiving votes to not get in. Spring Arbor out of Michigan was the second lowest team in receiving votes to not get in. And Park out of Missouri, they got in. They got in the tournament. They were the lowest receiving votes teams. So out of the receiving votes teams, that if you wanted to not figure out exactly how many receiving votes they had, so the teams that got in just on receiving votes alone, without figuring out all the exact numbers that they got: Northwest out of Washington, Huntington, Indiana, Taylor, Indiana, Lindsey Wilson, Kentucky, Mid-America Nazarene out of Kansas, Marion out of Indiana, Cornerstone out of Michigan, Walla Walla out of Washington, and Park out of Missouri. Those were all your receiving votes teams. Your receiving votes teams that did not get in the tournament were Evangel out of Missouri, Cumberland out of Tennessee, OUAZ out of Arizona, Montana State University Northern out of Montana, Dakota State out of South Dakota, Dordt out of Iowa, and Spring Arbor out of Michigan. So that is a in-depth look at the teams that did not get in the national tournament that were receiving votes. And then the only team ranked inside the top 25 that did not get in was Southern Oregon. Everybody else that was ranked inside the top 25 got in as well. So that will do it for this video. And if this video, I know this was a ton of information, but if it was super helpful to you, if it was informative, please either like, comment, or subscribe. Any one of those options helps me out greatly. And for those of you that are already subscribed to the channel, I really appreciate that. And please keep sharing my channel with your friends, your family, anybody that you know. Please tell them to keep subscribing to my channel. My goal is to hit 500 subscribers by February 21st, 2026. So let's hit that goal of 500 subscribers. And a very last, very quick note: my first episode of men's and women's basketball daily game recaps are going to be coming your way Thursday after all of the games tomorrow night, and then recapping all the games from this upcoming Saturday I'll be doing next Monday. So again, make sure that you stay tuned for all of those. I'm really looking forward to another season of exciting basketball games outside or in the Crossroads League to recap. Thanks so much for tuning in this video. Have a great rest of your day, a fantastic rest of your week, and God bless.